You won't believe what this successful businessman had to face. He simply purchased an economy ticket to evaluate his airline service. However, what happened next will leave you surprised. Stay tuned until the end to discover the complete story, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Your opinion is important. The cabin was beginning to fill up as passengers boarded Flight 437, one of Star's most frequent routes, an airline recognized for offering high-quality services in a serene environment. Amidst his executive duties, Isaac Marcel, the CEO of Airstar and owner of several airlines, decided to directly experience what a regular customer might encounter on one of his flights. For him, airplanes were not just a business matter, but also a matter of reputation, values, and commitment to excellence. Dressed in casual clothes, with no indication of his status, he expected to travel incognito and observe the service in economy class, fulfilling his company's promises. He arrived at the check-in counter well before mingling with the crowd and felt a few looks here and there. A fairly common experience that people did not expect to see, watching a man like him, alone, without any entourage, checking in without any fanfare. However, he continued making his way through security without paying attention to the suspicious looks from the airport staff. He was already accustomed to such looks, as if they were questioning whether he had ever belonged to an airplane. Isaac took his seat in silence, observing the interactions between the crew and the other passengers. He hoped this experience would reaffirm his company's service quality and perhaps provide ideas for additional improvements. However, there was something in the air, an almost palpable sense of unease that seemed to linger every time his gaze met that of the flight attendants. As he settled in, a flight attendant named Carla walked down the aisle, checking tickets and assisting passengers with their luggage. When she reached his row, her expression changed. Instead of the friendly smile she had shown to passengers before, she looked him in the eyes. "Sir, you are in the correct seat," she asked in an overly formal tone. Isaac nodded, showing her his ticket without saying a word, and with a serene smile on his face, he felt her gaze linger on him longer than necessary. She scanned him as if looking for a reason to interrogate him further. She nodded in response and continued down the aisle, murmuring something under her breath. Isaac couldn't hear what she was saying, but he noticed how she walked away with an air of disdain. As the plane filled with passengers, he continued to calmly observe the interactions around him, hoping that the initial hostility would dissipate and that Carla's tense attitude was merely a passing moment of stress in a demanding work environment. However, when the last passenger boarded and the doors closed, he noticed that she was still looking at him with evident irritation. Shortly after takeoff, Carla began the cabin service. But when she reached his row, she seemed to deliberately stop, showing a bit of disdain on her face. She barely acknowledged his presence, giving him a quick nod before swiftly moving to the next row. "Excuse me," he called out, hoping for a bit of civility in the interaction. "Could you bring me a glass of water, please?" Carla paused, slowly turning her head towards him. She scanned him from head to toe before responding. "We will get to you as soon as we can, sir," she said with an impatient tone. "There are other people we need to attend to first." Isaac held back his surprise and nodded courteously, hoping she would consider his tone, but instead, she abruptly turned away, almost defiantly, and continued down the aisle. Isaac took a deep breath, wanting to think it was just a misunderstanding or that Carla was having a bad day, but her attitude unsettled him. He decided to let it go and make the most of the experience, no matter how unusual it might seem, since this was his company's flight. As the owner, he wanted to understand every aspect. As the flight progressed, he realized that she made rounds to other passengers, all with a pleasant smile, offering drinks and meals. Every time she approached a section, her expression hardened as if she were invisible. This strange attitude soon spread to the rest of the crew. 2 more attendants passed by completely ignoring him, which frustrated him, but he maintained his composure. Isaac reclined, silently observing as the crew continued, avoiding attending to him despite his polite attempts to request the standard services offered to all other passengers. Over time, Carla finally returned to his row, this time carrying a tray. Isaac felt relieved, thinking that perhaps now she would finally attend to him. However, as she leaned in, she spilled the tray, and a steaming cup of coffee poured directly over his face. The hot liquid made him gasp instinctively as he wiped his face, feeling the burn on his skin. It was more than accidental. Carla's face showed no surprise or shock, only a cold indifference as she watched him back away. "Wow," she said, barely hiding a smile. "Looks like you're a bit clumsy." "No," Isaac's skin burned, and he held back from letting out a harsh response. He could feel the other passengers' gazes on him, their critical looks intensifying his discomfort. The burn felt even more acute. He tried to find Carla's gaze with calm determination, hoping she might show a hint of remorse or apology, but she only watched him with barely given attention, full of disdain. "Could you at least bring me a napkin?" He managed to keep his voice steady. "I'm sorry, sir. We're all busy," she replied before turning away, not even looking back at him as she walked off. Isaac felt the surge of anger growing within him. He expected professionalism and respect, even in its most basic form of courtesy, which he had always sought to instill in his company's spirit. But here he was being treated as if he were less than any other passenger. This contradicted every principle he believed in and every standard he had established. As the flight continued, he sat in silence, allowing the pain on his skin to remind him why he was there. The hostile treatment, the derogatory looks, the coldness, each small insult adding up, turning his experience into something much darker than he had anticipated. However, this was only the beginning. He continued observing, withholding his true identity, determined to understand the depth of the problems he was witnessing. If this was the treatment allowed in his own airlines, then there was much more at stake than just a flight. He knew that change would come somehow, but for now, he waited patiently until the moment to reveal himself. Isaac remained seated in his seat with his face still burning from the boiling coffee Carla had intentionally spilled on him. He felt the weight of the other passengers' gazes on him, as if each one was silently judging him for what had happened. Without knowing the truth, he forced himself to stay calm, knowing that revealing his identity now would only shift the focus of his presence. He was there to observe and understand the true quality of service his airline offered to all its customers, but what he began to witness was much worse than he had anticipated. When the flight attendants continued their rounds, it became clear that Carla's behavior was not an isolated incident. Soon, a second attendant named Mark approached Isaac's row, serving food to each passenger. Isaac raised a hand to indicate he wanted some food, only for Mark to look at him with disdain and move on, as if he hadn't seen him. His stomach grumbled, but he swallowed his frustration, determined to keep observing every denial, every cold back, every derogatory look that turned away from the courteous behavior he had strived to maintain. After a few more minutes, Isaac decided to try again, hoping Mark would pass by on his way back. This time he called out politely, "Excuse me, sir, can I have something to eat?" Mark hardened his face as he turned to look at Isaac. "I'm sorry, we're out of food," he said. His voice lacked any empathy. "You should have asked earlier." Isaac looked down the aisle, seeing that they were still distributing food, but he held back his response, nodding instead. He felt that this attitude was more than just a coincidence. A question began to form in his mind about how often his employees treated passengers this way. He had built his company on principles of respect and equality, but here he was experiencing exactly the opposite. Isaac leaned back, watching Mark continue down the aisle, feeling the weight of what he was learning heavily on his shoulders. His own employees were treating him as an owner, as if he were less than human, simply because they thought he was an ordinary man, a nobody in their eyes. He could see the cold amusement in their faces, the satisfaction they seemed to get from withholding even the slightest courtesy, and worst of all, he perceived a tacit agreement among the staff that somehow made him a problem. Someone who did not deserve the basic respect given to others. Isaac's patience was running out, but he reminded himself of the purpose of his trip. He had come on this flight to see the truth, and now that he was seeing it, he knew he had to dig deeper to understand every aspect of what was happening. He sat in silence, observing the silent pact of disrespect and noting every detail. Then, just as he was organizing his thoughts, Carla returned to his row, stopping beside him. Isaac looked up with a faint hope that she might finally recognize him with some respect, but her expression was anything but friendly. Her eyes narrowed, her lips curled into a sneer, and without saying a word, she dropped a glass of water onto the tray in front of him, spilling it over the edge and soaking his lap. "Careful, you wouldn't want to make a mess," she said sarcastically. "Though it seems like you're already used to it." Isaac felt the cold water soaking his pants, but maintained his composure, looking directly at her with a calm expression. He wanted to see if there was any sign of remorse on her face, any acknowledgement that her behavior was inappropriate, but her smile only widened as she turned away, leaving him soaked and humiliated. The other passengers around him avoided his gaze, perhaps embarrassed by the scene or uncomfortable with the open hostility. Isaac wondered if any of them would have said something if they knew who he really was, but then he realized it didn't matter. That was precisely the point. These people were ignoring him, and that's why he was here for hours while the hostile treatment persisted every time Carla or Mark passed by, completely ignoring his presence, even when he tried to request a napkin to dry himself. Isaac sat in silence, feeling the discomfort of the wet fabric clinging to his skin. Each denial added to the growing sense of frustration. It wasn't just about the lack of service, but the deliberate and calculated way they refused to acknowledge his existence, treating him as if he were invisible, like someone unimportant. Finally, as the meal service was coming to an end, he saw Carla approach again, this time carrying a fresh tray. Isaac felt a knot in his stomach from hunger, but he had lost hope that they would serve him. She stopped beside him, lifting the tray with a theatrical gesture and looking at him with disdain. "Smile. Don't assume you're still waiting for the food, right?" she asked with a contemptuous voice. Isaac didn't respond, keeping his gaze fixed, watching her with calm and determination. Carla tilted her head, pretending to think. "No, I don't think so. You don't seem to need anything else, right?" She laughed under her breath, and Mark joined her, sharing an arrogant smile. It was at that moment that Isaac realized the magnitude of their cruelty. This wasn't just poor service, but a humiliation directed at these people, their own employees. They openly mocked him, feeling justified in their disdain simply because of his appearance. He felt a flash of anger, but kept it under control, knowing his patience was wearing thin. As the plane began its descent, Carla and Mark passed by one last time. Their voices lowered, but their mocking laughter echoed in his ears. Isaac heard every insult and snub etched into his memory. He had come here to know the truth, and now the reality before him was that the respect he once considered fundamental for his airline was nothing more than a thin veneer masking latent prejudice. When the wheels touched the ground and passengers began to prepare to disembark, Carla turned to him one last time with a firmly placed smile. "Good day," she said with her voice full of sarcasm. Isaac nodded with a calm expression, though inside he felt the opposite. The moment of truth had arrived, and he could feel the weight of what he was about to reveal. But for now, he held back, letting them think they had won, that they had succeeded in treating him as less than human. When he stood up to leave, he caught a glimpse of himself in the small mirror on the back of the seat. His reflection met his gaze. He looked tired, but every ounce of his dignity remained intact despite the relentless barrage of insults. He knew they had kept their reason hidden, and soon they would understand exactly who he was. With that, he gathered his belongings, ready to dispense the justice they would never see coming. Isaac took a deep breath as the plane finally landed. Despite everything he had endured during the flight, he was determined to remain calm and composed as he prepared to disembark. But just as he stood up to collect his things, he noticed Carla and Mark watching him from the aisle, their expressions hardening as he approached. "Sir, we need you to sit back down," Carla said in a cold, authoritative tone, blocking his way. Her face was a mask of disdain. Isaac looked around, confused. The plane had landed. It was not time to disembark. "We have some things to discuss before you go anywhere," he replied, looking over his shoulder as if signaling someone else. Isaac felt a sharp sense of unease as Mark approached, standing behind Carla with his arms crossed in a defensive posture. Before Isaac could respond, Carla looked at him with an open stare. "We have received several complaints about your behavior," she announced, raising her voice so that nearby passengers could hear. "Others mentioned that you were being disruptive during the flight, causing a disturbance." Isaac's mouth opened in surprise. He had barely said a word since the flight began, and now they were accusing him of being disruptive. "That's not true," he responded, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I haven't caused any disturbance." Mark approached, his expression darkening. "Look, sir, we don't know why you're here, but this is not the place to act. You've been making loud noises, refusing to follow instructions, and overall, you've made the flight uncomfortable for other passengers." Isaac could feel the heat rising to his face, a mix of frustration and disbelief washing over him. "I haven't done any of those things. I've been sitting here in silence the entire time," he responded. As Carla mocked him, "That's not what we've heard. It's your interruption, and we're asking you to cooperate with us. Otherwise, we'll have to involve security." Isaac held his breath, struggling to contain his frustration. He could see the other passengers looking at them, a mix of discomfort and curiosity. This was an open spectacle, now a public accusation designed to humiliate him even further. "Look," Isaac said calmly but firmly, "I haven't done anything wrong. I've followed all the instructions given, and I would appreciate it if you would allow me to disembark the plane." However, Carla simply crossed her arms, giving him a look bordering on contempt. "We won't go anywhere until we've resolved this." At that moment, one of the pilots emerged from the cockpit. His gaze immediately settled on Isaac. Isaac felt a chill run down his spine as the pilot, a tall and imposing man named Jackson, walked towards him. His expression twisted with irritation. "What's the problem here?" Jackson demanded, narrowing his eyes as he looked at Isaac. "This passenger has been causing problems," Carla quickly responded, throwing a piercing look at Isaac. "He's been very disruptive. Frankly, I don't feel safe allowing him to disembark until we contact security." Isaac felt his patience waning. "It's not a threat to anyone here," he replied in a sharp but controlled tone. "I'm just trying to leave like any other passenger." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Jackson approached his face, contorted with irritation as he looked at Isaac from top to bottom. "We do not tolerate disorderly conduct on our flights," he said quietly. "We do not like passengers who think they are above the rules." Isaac tried to respond, but before he could say a word, Jackson extended his hand and grabbed him by the arm. Isaac felt a wave of shock as the pilot physically held him, pulling him back with surprising force. "What are you doing?" Isaac protested, struggling against Jackson's grip, but this only narrowed his eyes, shining with anger. "Stop resisting," Jackson growled. "You were given a direct instruction to remain seated, and now you're refusing to comply. This behavior is unacceptable." Isaac's heart pounded as he realized the full extent of Jackson's intentions. This was no longer just an act of hostility. It was a complete display of aggression, a power play designed to humiliate him for revenge. "I'm just trying to leave," Isaac said, his voice tense as he tried to free his arm, but Jackson ignored him and tightened his grip, pushing him back into his seat before Isaac could process what was happening. Mark approached with a pair of handcuffs, his expression cold and relentless. "If you refuse to cooperate, we'll have to restrain you," Mark said in an unemotional tone. Isaac stared at him in disbelief, his mind racing. This was a nightmare, a horrible scene unfolding before his eyes. He had come here to observe and understand the true experience of his passengers, but now he was being treated like a criminal, an object of disdain and mockery. Before he could protest further, Mark put the handcuffs on his wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin. Isaac grimaced, feeling the humiliation wash over him in waves as they forcefully restrained him. "Maybe now you'll understand the consequences of causing a disturbance," Mark said arrogantly, stepping back to admire his work. "Perhaps now you'll understand what it's like to be treated as a burden." Isaac tried to maintain his composure, but he could feel the weight of his anger growing. He had done nothing to deserve this treatment, nothing that justified such brutality, but they saw him as someone less than human, unworthy of respect or compassion. Now they had made him a prisoner on his own plane. Jackson gestured for him to lie down on the floor, his harsh voice ordering him to stay there until they said otherwise. Isaac hesitated, but Jackson's gaze told him that obedience was the only option. Reluctantly, he lay down on the floor, feeling the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into his wrists as he lay there, exposed and vulnerable. He could hear the silent whispers of the other passengers, their voices filling the air with a mix of surprise and curiosity, but no one spoke. No one dared to challenge the crew's actions. He was completely alone, isolated in his suffering. Every time he tried to move or adjust his position, Mark seemed to give him a quick and painful push or a kick to remind him of his place. "Stay still," Mark growled, his voice full of contempt. "You won't go anywhere until we say so." Isaac gritted his teeth, the pain and humiliation mixing with a burning rage inside him. He had come here to observe, to know the truth about his company's service, and now he was exposed to him in all his cruelty. Time seemed to stretch on as he lay there, each second extending into eternity. He could feel the pain in his limbs, the cold bite of the handcuffs, the sting of each insult, and every indignity, but despite everything, he clung to a thought, the knowledge that soon they would understand the full extent of their mistake. After what seemed like an eternity, the announcement came over the intercom, indicating that it was time to disembark. Isaac remained still, hoping the crew would not release him so he could fend for himself. But instead, Jackson and Mark exchanged a quick look and a smile passed between them as they watched Isaac enjoying his helplessness. "You're staying right where you are," Jackson said in a cold and authoritative tone. "Airport security will take care of you." Isaac felt a surge of anger, but forced himself to remain calm and hold onto his dignity. He knew his moment of revelation was approaching, that soon they would see him as he really was, but for now, he would wait, enduring their cruelty with silent resolve. When the plane stopped, he lay there handcuffed and humiliated, his mind racing with the weight of everything he had experienced. He had seen the truth, felt it in every insult, every blow, every calculated act of disrespect, and he knew for certain that justice would soon be served. Isaac lay on the cold, hard floor of the plane, his wrists tightly bound by handcuffs that bit into his skin with every slight movement. Every attempt to change his position to find even a small degree of comfort was met with a quick, aggressive shove from Mark, a kick to keep him under control. The cruelty in their actions was undeniable, each shove and kick delivered with a satisfaction bordering on pleasure. He could feel their disdain, their willingness to see him suffer, as if he were less than human. Time seemed to move slowly, each minute dragging into an eternity as he lay there, listening to the noise of other passengers gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. It reached his ears like a distant hum. He could hear whispers ranging from discomfort to curiosity. He felt the weight of their judgment, their silent complicity regarding his suffering. Each one of them was a witness, but none dared to speak out against the injustice unfolding before their eyes. Isaac held his breath, trying to stabilize his mind to focus amidst the rising tide of anger and humiliation. He had come here to understand and observe his company's service from the perspective of an ordinary customer, but he had never anticipated this descent into cruelty, a display of contempt that stripped him of his dignity and left him feeling powerless. He was Isaac Marcel, a man who had built his company on principles of respect and integrity, but there he lay, reduced to a prisoner handcuffed to the floor of his own plane. As he remained there, trying to keep his emotions under control, Mark approached again, standing over him with a look of satisfaction. "Stay here and," Mark mocked, "don't think about moving a muscle." Isaac clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm to endure a little longer. He knew his moment of revelation was approaching, and that soon they would understand the full extent of his mistake, but each passing second undermined his resolve, accumulating humiliation and rage within him like a storm waiting to be unleashed. From a distance, he heard the intercom come to life. The pilot's voice was heard over the speakers, announcing that the plane had landed and that passengers could disembark freely. Isaac lay still, waiting for the crew not to release him, so he could fend for himself. However, Jackson and Mark had other plans. They exchanged a quick look and a smile passed between them as they watched Isaac enjoying his helplessness. "You're staying right where you are," Jackson said in a cold and authoritative tone. "Airport security will take care of you." Isaac felt a surge of anger, but forced himself to remain calm and hold onto his dignity. He knew his moment of revelation was approaching, that soon he would have the opportunity to reveal his true identity and expose the cruelty and prejudice that had developed on that flight. As the officers led him down the aisle, he felt the crew's gazes on him, their arrogant smiles and expressions of satisfaction burning in his memory. He made a silent promise at that moment, a promise that he would make each of them accountable for their actions and ensure they faced the consequences of their cruelty. Once they reached the exit, the officers led him downstairs to the pavement, the cold air biting his skin as he took his first breath of freedom. But the handcuffs were still attached to his wrists, a constant reminder of the injustice he had endured. He walked towards the terminal, one of the officers finally removing the handcuffs, softening his expression as he looked at Isaac. "You are free to go," he said quietly. Isaac met the officer's gaze, his eyes hard with determination. "Thank you," he replied, his tone steady but firm, "but I'm not finished yet." The officer gave him a curious look but said nothing, simply nodding as he stepped aside, allowing Isaac to enter the terminal. Upon entering the airport, Isaac felt a surge of determination rising within him. He knew he had the responsibility not only for himself, but for all the passengers who had ever been subjected to the same cruelty and lack of respect he had just experienced. He had seen the truth and felt it in every insult, every act of aggression, and now that he was ready to bring that truth to light, he headed to the airline's office within the terminal. His mind was racing with the weight of everything he had endured. He knew his actions would have consequences, that exposing the truth would shake the foundations of his company, but he also knew that change was necessary. It could only come from confronting the darkness that had taken root in his organization. As he approached the office, he took a deep breath, preparing for what awaited him. He could feel the staff's gazes on him. When he entered, their expressions ranged from curiosity to disbelief. They didn't recognize him, didn't know who he was or why he was there, but that was about to change. With a firm hand, he reached for his identification and handed it to the receptionist with a calm and determined expression. "I am Isaac Marcel," he said with a firm and unwavering voice. "I am the owner of this airline, and I need to speak with whoever is in charge immediately." The receptionist's eyes widened in shock, and her face paled as she realized the meaning of his words. She stammered a quick response, gesturing for him to wait as she hurriedly made a call with her voice full of newfound respect and urgency. Isaac waited with his heart pounding, a mix of anger and determination. He knew this was just the beginning. The journey he was about to undertake would be difficult and painful, but he also knew it was necessary. Justice demanded nothing less. As he remained there, waiting for the meeting that would set everything in motion, he felt a sense of peace invade him. He had endured the worst, had seen the truth in all its cruelty, and now he was ready to bring that truth to light, ensuring that no one else would suffer as he had on that flight. For Isaac Marcel, the battle had just begun. In the silence of the airline office, with his heart still racing from the anger and humiliation he had endured on the flight, the memory of Carla's smile, Mark's mockery, and Jackson's cold brutality remained fresh in his mind. He hoped to speak with the airline's top executive at the terminal, feeling a new sense of resolve strengthening within him. He was waiting for the moment when the truth would come to light, and those who had wronged him would face all the consequences of their actions. The receptionist looked at him with a mix of surprise and astonishment, her hands trembling as she made the call to the director to convey his identity in a hurried whisper. Isaac watched her, noticing the change in her behavior the moment she realized he was the owner of the airline and no longer an anonymous passenger. To her, he was Isaac Marcel, the man behind the very company she worked for. "For Mr. Marcel, our operations manager will be with you shortly," she said with a voice full of newfound respect, pointing to a comfortable nearby seat. But Isaac remained standing, his gaze firm and unwavering. Within minutes, a man in an impeccable suit entered the room. His expression a mix of confusion and concern as he approached Isaac, extending his hand, but Isaac simply nodded with his rigid posture, waiting for the man to speak. Mr. Marcel, I am Thomas Avery, head of operations, he said with a deferential voice. I was informed that you had an urgent matter to discuss. Please, how can we assist you? Isaac held the man's gaze, his voice calm but authoritative. I just arrived on one of your flights for 37, and I think it's safe to say I did not receive the treatment that any passenger, and certainly not the owner of this airline, deserves. Thomas's face paled, and he looked around nervously. I'm very sorry to hear that, Mr. Marcel. Could you tell me what happened? Over the next few minutes, Isaac recounted every detail of the flight in a measured and controlled voice. Describing the treatment he had endured, he spoke about Carla's blatant attitude, her lack of respect, and the cold refusal to serve him, as well as the cruel act of spilling hot coffee on his face. He described Mark's cold indifference, his aggressive comments, and the moment when Jackson, the pilot, had physically assaulted him, immobilizing him with handcuffs and forcing him to lie on the floor like a criminal. With each word, he saw Thomas's expression change from confusion to disbelief and finally to horror as Isaac finished. Thomas was visibly shocked, his face flushing as he struggled to process what he had just heard. I don't know what to say, Thomas murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't believe it. Isaac narrowed his eyes. Believe it, I experienced it firsthand. And yes, this is how my own employees treat a passenger they deem unworthy. So we have a much bigger problem on our hands. Thomas swallowed hard and nodded in agreement. You are absolutely right, Mr. Marcel. I assure you, this is not the standard of service we strive for. I will personally ensure that the responsible individuals are held accountable. Isaac raised a hand, silencing Thomas. I don't want promises, sir. I want immediate action. I want all members of that team, Carla, Mark, Jackson, and anyone else who supported their behavior, to be fired. I also want this incident documented in their records, and I expect a thorough investigation into how they managed to remain employed in the first place. Thomas quickly nodded, pulling out a notepad and scribbling down Isaac's instructions, his hand trembling slightly as he wrote. Understood, sir. I will take care of it immediately. Isaac studied him for a moment, evaluating his sincerity. He could see that Thomas was genuinely horrified by what had happened, but he wasn't ready to place his trust so easily. Too many things had been revealed during that flight, too many cracks in the foundations he had once believed to be solid. There's one more thing, Isaac said, softening his tone slightly but maintaining his upper hand. I want to address the crew personally. I want them to know exactly who I am and understand the full extent of their actions. Thomas's eyes widened, and he hesitated for a brief moment before nodding. Of course, Mr. Marcel. I already have the private conference room ready immediately. Isaac nodded with a somber satisfaction, taking control as Thomas left to arrange the meeting he had requested. He knew that confronting the crew would be difficult and that the confrontation would test his moderation, but he also understood that it was necessary for them to see him to know the truth of who he was and what they had done. After a few minutes, Thomas returned with a tense expression as he gestured for Isaac to follow him. You are being waited for in the conference room, sir, he said, his voice full of a mix of fear and respect. Isaac followed him down a narrow hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence as they approached the door. At the end of the hallway, Thomas opened it, revealing a small conference room where Carla, Mark, and Jackson were seated with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed irritation. The moment Isaac entered, the atmosphere changed. Carla's eyes widened like saucers when she recognized him, her arrogant expression disappearing upon realizing who was standing in front of her. Mark looked equally stunned, his mouth open as he glanced between Isaac and Thomas, but it was Jackson's reaction that sparked a flash of satisfaction in Isaac's heart. The pilot's face paled, and his gaze fixed on Isaac with a mix of fear and disbelief. Isaac took a deep breath, allowing the silence to take over the room before speaking. I'm sure you all recognize me now. He began speaking in a calm voice, but with a tone that sent a chill down their spines. I am Isaac Marcel, the owner of this airline, and you have all committed a serious error. Carla, he said, Carla, averting her gaze with her face flushed with shame, looked away, while Mark and Jackson exchanged nervous glances. Their confidence crumbled in an instant. During the course of that flight, Isaac continued, scanning each of them. You treated me as if I were less than human. You ignored me, you humiliated me, and subjected me to physical abuse. All because you assumed I was just another passenger. He paused, letting his words sink in, watching as the weight of his accusations fell upon them. You thought you could act with impunity, that there would be no consequences for your actions. But you were wrong. Jackson cleared his throat, his trembling voice trying to explain. Mr. Marshall, if I had known... Isaac dismissed him with a brusque gesture. It shouldn't matter who I am, whether I am the owner of this airline or a regular customer. I deserve the same respect and courtesy you would show to anyone else. But instead, you chose to treat me this way and, by extension, anyone who doesn't meet your standards. Carla's expression wrinkled as tears filled her eyes, stammering a desperate apology. Please, I didn't mean it, I thought. Isaac raised a hand to silence her. Forgive me. Your apologies mean nothing to me. Your actions have spoken louder than any other words you could have uttered. Mark moved uncomfortably, his pale face struggling to find Isaac's gaze. Is there anything we can do to rectify this? Isaac narrowed his eyes, his voice cold. There is nothing you can do to erase what has been done, but there are consequences. You have all been fired from your positions within this airline. Your records will reflect the nature of your actions, and I will personally ensure that this incident is known to anyone considering hiring you in the future. A heavy silence fell over the room as the weight of his words settled in. Carla's face wrinkled, and she began to cry, her tears silently falling as she understood the magnitude of her actions. Mark looked at him with a pale, defeated face, while Jackson clenched his fists, his expression barely concealing his anger. Isaac watched them, feeling a sense of justice taking hold of him. He had endured their cruelty and humiliation, but now that he had reclaimed his dignity, he had shown them the truth of who he was, and they would never forget it. I hope this serves as a lesson, Isaac said in a final tone. Every passenger boarding one of my flights deserves respect, regardless of their appearance, and I will not tolerate anything less. He turned and left the room with a heavy heart but resolute, knowing that the battle for change was far from over and that there was still work to be done to eradicate the prejudice and cruelty that had infected his company. But he was prepared to face that challenge, rebuilding his airline on a foundation of respect and integrity. As he walked towards the exit, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had seen the worst of humanity on that flight, but he had also found the strength to rise above it and ensure that justice was served. If this video has helped you connect more with yourself and inspired you on your growth journey, take action and subscribe to the Vidasta Inspiration channel to discover more stories that will fill you with motivation and hope. I would love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment telling me how this story has impacted your life or what reflections it has left you with. And if you believe this message can inspire someone you know, share it with your friends so they too can find inspiration and purpose in their lives.